Monstruozan zločin u BiH. Kriminalac i fitness trener ubio je svoju suprugu. Zločin je prenosio uživo na Instagram.
Krenuo je potom u krvavi pohod i nastavio objavljivati prijetnje. Smaknuo je 2 ljudi u Gradačcu, a ranio je još 3.
Prvo je pred šokiranom javnošću smaknuo nevjenčanu suprugu, koja ga je prije nekoliko dana prijavila za nasilničko ponašanje. Potom je krenuo dalje.
I dok se javnost zgražava nad svirepim ubistvom Nizame Hećimović, koji je počinio njen nevjenčani suprug i pokušava psihološki, sociološki i ljudski shvatiti zašto, ubijena je još jedna žena u Živinicama i nju je ubio njen supružnik.
U sarajevskom naselju Alipašino polje 34-godišnji muškarac usmrtio je svoju bivšu partnericu, majku njihovog 4-godišnjeg djeteta.
Početkom srpnja u Bisagu kraj Varaždina muškarac je aktivirao ručnu bombu i njome ubio suprugu i sebe.
Juče je u Novom Sadu momak ubio svoju bivšu devojku, pa potom i sebe.
U Bihaću je početkom sedmice muž 32-godišnju suprugu prvo pretukao, a onda zadavio kablom.
Goran zverski izmasakrirao sestre sa Bežanije.
Na telo nesrećne žene nađeno u lokvi krvi.
Našli su se, a onda je sve krenulo po zlu.
Bio je sa 2 udarca sekirom, pa telo zakopao u podsobu.
I ubio tetku, pozvao druga da dođe po njega.
Stan poznanici otkrili da je
Aleksandar ubio ženu na odmoru, pa se ugušio.
Ubio devojčicu nakon komšijske svađe. Strašno.
Dozivala je decu, ona su je zatekla u lokvi krvi.
Nožem ubio ženu kod prijatelja na večeri.
Snimao je dok je ležala na samrti, a onda za sve...
Muž izdršetao ženu, pa izvršio samoubistvo.
Ženu pa je davio dok nije izdahnula.
Najbliže komšije tvrde da je žrtva više puta fizički maltretiran od strane nevenčanog supruga, koji je 2 puta osuđivan za nasilje u porodici.
Kažu da je ubojica još u decembru prošle godine dobio mjeru zabrane prilaska svojoj nevjenčanoj supruzi na manje od 500 metara i to u trajanju od 2 godine, međutim nastavio je s nasiljem.
Počinitelju je prethodno bila izrečena mjera zabrane prilaska, koju je prekršio.
Radi se o osobi koja je više puta osuđivana za različita krivična djela, između ostalog osuđivanje prije 15 godina i za krivično djelo pokušaja ubistva. Ima nekoliko presuda za nasilnička ponašanja, ugrožavanje sigurnosti. Imao je i prijave za nasilje u porodici, međutim ono što moramo reći je da se uvijek koristile blagodeti zakona, odnosno odustajalo se od svjedočenja.
Policajci, silovatelji, obiteljski nasilnici, žene koje su nakažene jer su se usudile reći da se žele razvesti. Predivno je biti žena u ovoj državi, 3. zemlji u Europskoj uniji po broju ubijenih žena i zemlji u čijim zakonima i dalje nigdje ne postoji riječ femicid. Očekivalo se da bi vlada to danas mogla promijeniti, ali uzalud.
U Bosni i Hercegovini postoji sud koji je jednom ubicu dodijelio 1 godinu dana zatvora zato što je samohrani otac. Ne gledajući da je on samohrani otac zato što je ubio drugu roditeljku.
9 nedelja od početka godine i isto toliko ubijenih žena u Srbiji. Sve su bile žrtve partnera ili bliske osobe. Većina njih prijavljivala je nasilje partnera koje je prethodilo ubistvu.
Ubojstvo žene u Novskoj 11. je slučaj femicida u 8 mjeseci ove godine.
Protekle 2 godine u Bosni i Hercegovini ubijeno je 19 žena, a prema podacima OSCE-a 84% žena ne prijavljuje nasilje zbog straha i nepovjerenja u institucije zaštite.
A woman's life is worth nothing. Not because I believe that, but because that seems to be the conclusion of decades of tragedies and hundreds of lives lost at the hands of husbands, exes, family members, and strangers alike. And every time we seem perplexed and caught off guard, baffled and surprised at how something like that could ever happen. Many of you might have trouble understanding what the big deal is, why you should care in the grand scheme of things, and why you might even be complicit in this whole ordeal. And yes, complicit indeed. You, myself, and everyone else with an XY chromosome in the midst of this modern crisis of masculinity, who has ever shrugged their shoulders and dismissed violence against women as a mere exception committed by a minority of monsters and how there's nothing they can do. Now, what if I told you that there is actually a lot you can do that takes very little effort, but elevates you to being a respectable man who stands up for the rights and well-being of all our fellow mothers, daughters, sisters, wives, girlfriends, neighbors, co-workers, outcasts, friends, and foes of the opposite sex who, believe it or not, have to deal with fears and uncertainties beyond anything we ever had to contend with, and that we, often unconsciously, are a source of. I mean, the very least you can do is watch this video and share it with your male friends, and the very least I will do is make it as approachable as possible. And by the end, I'm sure we can come to a common conclusion that the effort required from us to make a huge impact on literally 4 billion lives is surprisingly small. Only vigilance and consciousness regarding small and big things alike that we usually tend to ignore, but which can make the difference between life and death to any woman. That is, every second human being out there that you've ever met. So, to illustrate just how absurd our collective attitude currently is to this phenomenon, allow me to recite you a short but eloquent piece of prose. A man kills a woman. If he doesn't kill himself immediately afterwards, then other men, police officers, go on a manhunt after him. Those same policemen who don't react to reports on male violence either openly mock the victims or stand in defense of the perpetrator when they're on duty. Or they are perhaps violent offenders themselves. They go forward with their weapons to detain or kill that other man. People applaud them by saying, "Good job, police." They say, "Job well done, our heroes." A woman, even in her own murder, plays a secondary role. Here's a memory from a couple of years ago. A black car in front of the American embassy in Sarajevo. He is tall and skinny, but has a pit bull next to him, screaming into her face, "Get in the car." The entire Marin Dvor can hear him. Next to her, there's another woman observing the situation, petrified. She enters the car. The car speeds away with screeching tires. The other woman crosses the street and finds herself in front of the historical museum as I run towards the embassy. In front, some 3 meters away from the whole ordeal, there's a guard standing. I ask him why he didn't react. "What am I supposed to do? A husband and a wife are fighting. There's her sister to react," says he while gesturing towards the girl that's now wandering towards the University of Philosophy. A tiny bag is hanging from her shoulder. A gun is hanging from the guard's shoulder. It's the 9th of March, one day after the 8th of March. "Well, happy International Women's Day to us then," I tell him. And such men will congratulate us on Women's Day. But only to ladies, never to female workers, peasants, witches, or castaways. Only to ladies, to those they deem as their prettier halves. Women are there to be pretty and only to be a half. They're an item in titles such as, "Look at the luxurious wife of this famous football player. Car, watch, wife." One object next to another. Then they will proceed to act surprised when a man kills a woman. Only a minute later, they'll search their browser for Pornhub. On Pornhub, click on the most viewed video. "Shy teen destroyed by cock like a toy." And they'll keep wondering, surprised. How is that possible? A well-intended man will ask another well-intended man before showing him a photo from Instagram. "Look at this one, throwing out her boobs. Only those who haven't asked didn't go through her." They'll keep wondering, those well-intended men, while watching an evening program on the rise of femicides. They'll yell towards the kitchen, "Wife, give me a beer," while sighing in disbelief. What a maniac. What a maniac indeed. That guy that catcalls women on the street, that still remembers every detail of Severina's homework, while forgetting to remember the name of the man that posted that as an insult and blackmail, that during a World Cup game jokingly tells his wife to not dare walk in front of the TV. Ha ha, a joke, a jest, humor. It's just that these damn feminists have no sense of humor. For them, it's either life or death. Usually death because they tend to get killed by men like it's a piece of cake. Then that same well-intended man writes on Twitter, "This guy that killed a man and a child can't be a man. He's just a pussy." Just a pussy. Everything worthy of loathing has to be female, doesn't it? They will go through life, such well-intended men, convinced in their own innocence, while feeding the fire that swallows female lives with their words and actions. And women will only add sticks and branches. They will also write, "Such a bitch for what she's done to the man," because they've been raised that way. Because deep inside, the fear that they felt as soon as they became aware of their female body eventually turned into the conviction that they can survive only by consenting to their own degradation. Men have their bros. Women are each other's nemesis. What the hell do you want? You have all the rights while we die in wars. Men die in wars that other men are leading. When women call for peace, they say, "Get out of my way, woman." When they get killed, it's women's fault. Women are at fault for male deaths and for their own death. They're at fault always and for everything. People were killed. I won't separate victims by gender. All lives matter equally, says someone in the comment section. I'm trying to remember when was the last time that a woman took a gun and out of nowhere, out of the blue, started firing. I cannot remember. But that's why every week I see new victims. And every time I expect the world to stop, I expect an earthquake, but nothing happens. Nobody even bats an eye. Officially, nobody even counts. If any other group in society was dying as frequently as women, we would have emergency meetings, be changing laws, calling for drastic measures. However, not all lives are worth equally. The lives of women, for example, are worth nothing. Only some 300 likes when you record yourself while murdering them. Misandry, the enlightened feminist will say. That's not the point. To hate men. Why would you hate men, they ask, and nobody asks what exactly men have done not to be loathed, with what they have deserved not to be hated. They kill you, rape you, beat you up, degrade you, humiliate you, but don't hate them, and I don't. I don't have the energy for that. I just want them to get out of my way. From my way, my mother's, aunts, cousins, and friends' way. Out of the way of all women that just want to be and to live. One man and one woman on the gateway to happiness. Because a woman isn't a man. A woman is a woman, more useful than a watch, but not as worth as much as a car. Men would never do harm to their car. What you just heard is an article written by Selma Asotic in response to the gruesome murders that happened on the 12th of August 2023 in the small town of Gradačac in Bosnia and Herzegovina. A man had murdered his ex-wife and 2 other people in cold blood and streamed the whole ordeal live on Instagram, after which he committed suicide. The video was online for 3 hours before it was taken down, so it was more than enough time for the entire country, region, and world to see and to wonder. How could something like this ever happen? And we keep wondering the same thing every single time this has happened in the country of Bosnia, all these 56 times since the year 2015. As soon as the initial shock wears down, we revert to our old ways and act surprised again and again, every single time we see such tragedies reported in the news. We view them as isolated and sporadic excesses of violence expressed by maniacs and psychopaths, followed by the classic platitude that it's not all men, and that there's not much we can do to stop it. Another platitude thrown around in this context are the infamous nadležni organi, the also righteous and omnipresent state structures whose responsibility and duty it apparently is to quote-unquote act accordingly and quote-unquote deal with the situation. What we often neglect here is the societal responsibility and complicitness we all bear as spectators and even accomplices in what has become an epidemic of gender-motivated homicides. Shoving the responsibility onto some abstract notion of state structures and authorities that are supposed to act and deliver justice in our stead, we leave literally half of the world's population in the dark to tend to themselves in increasingly toxic and unforgiving gender relations. But why heed the murders of women as something beyond simple homicide? Why give it special importance and classify it as femicide? I hear you asking. Why does gender play a role in this dynamic, and why are feminists so intent on accentuating these particular crimes? Aren't all victims' lives equally worth? Is it because they hate men or deem a woman's life as more valuable? No, not at all, actually. The reason we should observe and classify such homicides separately is because they have a very specific motivation and drive behind them. Just like hate crimes, involuntary manslaughter, and first-degree murder all specify different and nuanced degrees and types of crime. As Ivana Milovanovic, a judge from Serbia and expert for domestic violence, explains, femicide differs from other forms of murder because they're a case of gender-related murdering of women simply because they are women. This indicates that the underlying causes of femicide are different from other types of murder, and are related to the general position of women in society, discrimination against women, gender roles, unequal distribution of power between men and women, common gender stereotypes, prejudices, and violence against women. While in other parts of the world there are different forms of femicide, those women being the victims of killings for the sake of honor, murders under accusation of witchcraft, the consequences of illegal abortions, starvation, or denial of the right to treatment, the definition of femicide that best suits our context is the one given by Diana Russell and Jane Caputi in 1999, in the article Femicide Speaking the Unspeakable, stating that femicide is the killing of women by men out of hatred, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership of women, that is, sexism. With the rise in popularity of grifters such as Andrew Tate and the entire surrounding ecosystem of quote-unquote alpha male influencers, gurus, and mentors really came as an amalgamation of decades of piled-up frustrations, insecurities, and a general crisis of masculinity and what it means to be a man in today's society. And the source of such frustrations, merely articulated by the likes of Tate, is clear and unmistakable. Men are afraid of feminism, for a very selfishly rational reason. Just like a social class that has been in a position of power for centuries, and whose status quo is trying to desperately preserve itself at all costs against the resurrection and emancipation of lower, exploited classes. So are many men desperately clinging on to the remnants of the financial, political, and economic superiority they slowly feel slipping out of their grip, and are in good part subconsciously afraid that the power scale would tip in the other direction and maybe even leave them in a subordinate position. The steady emancipation of women over the past few decades has allowed many women to live a life of dignity, with less fear and uncertainty, and with increased bodily, political, and financial autonomy. Feminism has lifted the woman closer to the man's socioeconomic position, but by no means his equal. It has alleviated women of many fears and given them much autonomy, but it hasn't eradicated nor has it granted full, truly equal rights, regardless of what any cynical charlatan may try to sell you. The reason why female emancipation can never truly live up to its potential and genuinely equalize their position in society is impossible under our current socioeconomic system, and what the long-term solution to such an issue could be will be discussed in another upcoming video. Nonetheless, where there is more autonomy and freedom on the part of the woman, there is less privilege, less power, and less superiority that the man used to have up until very recently. So, just like a waning empire or decaying regressive social class, the status quo of the patriarchy, that word that encapsulates centuries of regressive social relations and irks and irritates the ears of many men, the desperation and frustration of the declining hegemon starts showing itself through erratic and destructive behavior, There are many parallels that can be drawn between the social relations between men and women, and those between socioeconomic classes on the historical stage. But this fundamentally antagonistic relation and the declining position of men is the basis of the rise in open misogyny, sexism, and as an extension, femicide. Just like Nazis and fascists are the ghouls and executors of a decaying capitalist system and embody all the frustrations, hatred, and malice of the declining and rotting status quo, there is an equivalent part of the male population that, in the downfall of the patriarchy, assumes the role of misogynist and incel. That significant portion of low-status men who feel threatened by female empowerment that cannot manage now having to compete with a surge of women on top of the pile of more successful, more desirable, and more powerful men now feel smaller and more threatened than ever before. And the result of this paranoid crisis? Prejudice, hatred, violence, and finally, femicide, as the final attempt at re-establishing control over the woman by taking her life. Now, many young men watching this will probably already have closed the video, and some of those remaining probably have a reason to protest or complain. And that's okay. It took me more than I like to admit to get rid of this internalized pity for the male world, an implicit irritation towards everything that has to do with feminism and the advocacy for equal rights. Hearing the word privilege directed at myself used to anger me for some unknown reason. From my perspective, everything seemed to be fair, and I just couldn't get why anyone would still keep complaining. And listening to women complain about their own problems, perhaps because of that internalized seed of misogyny, just didn't make me budge or understand. I was far from being actually misogynist, but I'd have to lie if I said that I wasn't at least a bit annoyed seeing feminists in action. Little did I know that that word named privilege, which tends to irritate and provoke anyone who truly does have it in life, was the reason why I couldn't see beyond my own nose. Despite being the reality of, again, literally half of all humans to have ever existed, I was, like many other young men, completely blind to all the small everyday things that pile up into a mountain of disadvantages and threats that every woman has to deal with every single day. Things that my male brain couldn't even begin to comprehend. Perhaps because, from this perspective, I was very much complicit in the poisonous attitude that a good chunk of men implicitly have towards women. And you know very well what I'm talking about. The good old jokes and jests. Bros before hoes. Haha. Women ruin our wholesome male friendships. Bring a stripper to the bachelor party. Now wouldn't that be funny? Boo-hoo, I gotta spend time with that annoying wife of mine. Women really can play sports, can they? Women are also bad drivers. They belong in the kitchen. Haha, just a little joke. Wife, bring me a sandwich and don't you dare walk in front of the TV. You know, catcalling women on the street in groups from a car window. Women aren't upset, they're hysterical. They're not excited about something they like, they're fangirls. Men are just passionate, and women, well, they're emotional. You know what I'm talking about. How many times have you heard such jokes or declarations and just politely nodded along and maybe even giggled a bit as it came out of the mouth of a friend of yours or a group of guys? And I know you never react to avoid being the outlier, to not sound like a simp, a beta, a cringe feminist who has no sense of humor and would fall in your friend's eyes. It's all fun and games and jokes until it isn't. You and I might not actively be sexist and misogynist, but guess what? You can never guarantee for that friend of yours. You can never know what goes on inside his mind after, let's say, a breakup, after being hurt by one woman after another, when his resentment cooks and boils together with his blood and rises as his ego is hurt and becomes vengeful, until one day it happens. And we all ask ourselves in shock, How could something like that ever happen? He was a good chap and wouldn't hurt a fly. It starts with the jokes, piles up with personal failure and resentment, and ends up in tragedy. So yes, dear friend, there is plenty you and I can do to help. And no, you don't have to put #feminist in your bio, erect a safe house, or organize a protest. At least not yet. Small, simple, everyday things that can make a big difference, and frankly, make you a bigger gigachad and green flag for everyone around you than any of those infantile alphas could ever wish for. For example, instead of encouraging that heartbroken friend of yours how all women are heartless hoes and gold diggers anyway, tell him to keep patiently searching until he finds the right one. Encourage him to perhaps even change a few things about himself, instead of wailing in self-pity and resentment. A woman doesn't owe him her body just because he was nice to her. A friend zone is not bitchy, heartless behavior, but her right to not like you, no matter how nice you are. And that's okay. Also, don't just passively nod to that incel coworker of yours, half-jokingly commenting how unqualified women are unfairly taking all of our jobs through enforced quotas, and how they belong to the kitchen, but rather explain to him that it's the capitalist system and corporate work culture that he ought to protest against, not women looking for jobs to feed 2 kids and pay rent. Next time when you hear someone blaming a victim of sexual assault, with the classic accusations how she was asking for it with the way she was dressing, how she wasn't careful enough, ask him why 10-year-old children get raped then, and why the majority of rapes are committed by close friends and family. Hell, maybe even show him this video of mine. It might even change his mind. Next time you're with a group of guys and see them catcalling and whistling after women in broad daylight and especially at dark, don't be afraid of condemnation to stop them. Speak up and tell them to stop being such a group of primitive buffoons. Let them know, in your own way, that they're not being cool macho alphas, but a lobotomized group of apes. And if you're yourself walking at night and see a woman walking on her own, just cross to the other side of the street, slow down and let her go her own way without presenting yourself as a potential threat. Just be aware of your surroundings and how women might perceive you in that kind of context. It might not be you or all men, but it's more than enough of us for a woman to be alert and cautious around every single one of us. Don't take it personally. And in case some well-intended guy does the same as you, but defends his position with the classic, "that could be your mother or daughter" there, interrupt him and explain how a woman doesn't have to be your mother or daughter to deserve respect, dignity, and to feel safe. A woman's worth doesn't come from her being related to you as a man, but for being a human being made of flesh and bones, just like yourself.